So good afternoon, everyone. We're very happy to welcome you for our 69th workshop series. And today we will listen at Renu Desai talk entitled Planning and the Production of Violence on the Urban Periphery, the case of Bombay Hotel in Ahmedabad. So Renu Desai is a urban researcher and coordinator at the Center for Urban Equity at State University in Ahmedabad since April 2013. Her research focuses on processes of urban informality and urban transformation in Indian cities. She has a PhD in architecture from the University of California, Berkeley. Her doctoral research examined the way in which urban space was being reshaped in Ahmedabad by the intersection of urban redevelopment, globalization, and Hindutva policy. Over the past several years, she has been involved in research projects on sanitation in informal settlement, land and housing tenures, displacement and resettlement, and construction workers housing in cities like Ahmedabad, Mumbai, Nagpur, and Guwahati. Renu is co-editor of Urbanizing Citizenship, Contested Spaces in Indian City at CSH 2012. So thank you very much, Renu, for coming all the way from Ahmedabad. And please.
Do I really need to use a mic or am I kind of loud enough? Don't like mics. Well, thanks, Christine. Thanks, Parthu and Marie, especially for inviting me to share the research that we've been doing over the last 2 years or so. This is just to kind of give you an introduction to the research project. This paper is part of a much larger research project that we've been involved in at the Center for Urban Equity since about 2.5 years now. It's a project that's funded by the IDRC and DFID under a global program that they have called Safe and Inclusive Cities, where the attempt is to look at the linkages between poverty, inequality, and violence in cities. And we have collaborated with the Institute for Human Development in Delhi on this research. Basically, the Center for Urban Equity has been doing research in Ahmedabad and Guwahati under this project, and IHD has been doing research in Delhi and Patna. So I am going to be presenting a very small part of this research, but it's consumed us quite a lot, as is the rest of it actually. So basically we have come to this project from the perspective of urban planning. So, you know, the larger program that IDRC and DFID have, various research grantees have approached these links between poverty, inequality, and violence through different perspectives, and we come to this project from our sort of domain of work, which is urban planning and governance. So the research questions that we came to on this project was basically to trace the pathways through which urban planning and governance leads to different types of violence on the poor and by the poor. In relation to that, the kind of specific questions that we were interested in asking is that what are the specific mechanisms of urban planning and governance that are becoming drivers of urban violence in Indian cities? What are people's experiences, and even within sort of the urban poor, what are the differentiated impacts depending on sort of income group, gender, caste, religion, etc. And then also interested in looking at people's responses. So how people kind of responded to the kind of impacts that urban planning and governance has on them. And this includes both people's organizations, but we're also talking about how NGOs mobilize people and those who are working at the grassroots. So how these responses, what kinds of responses there are. And then in response to that, what are the kind of interventions that the state as well as various non-state actors who might be formally working with the state or might be independently intervening in these spaces. So this could be private sector actors, NGOs, etc. And whether the interventions that they bring are these mitigating violence in these spaces and on these groups, or are they perpetuating them in new ways? Also, what are the geographies of urban violence in these cities? Uh, and then sort of what are the structural preconditions, which of course we can talk about them at different scales, from global, national, regional, and city level. But what are the different kind of structures that shape urban planning and governance in the first place, and shape how they become then drivers of urban violence in those specific cities and spaces. So that's kind of very broadly just giving you a introduction into the kind of research questions that inform our project. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but essentially, since the project is focusing on urban violence, I mean, of course, one of our main things has been to try to understand what is the current scholarship on urban violence itself. And there's a large set of debates in the scholarship on this, from people debating what are the factors that lead to urban violence. A lot of the scholarship also talks about violence in terms of crime. And within those debates, questions about, that it's not just sort of increasing rates of urbanization or increasing urban densities or increasing urban poverty that's leading to urban violence, but that questions of inequality are actually much more influential in terms of leading to violent outcomes. And as I said, a lot of this literature does look at violence as crime. Also, various people talking about how unemployment and changing livelihoods, declining social capital and cohesion, links between youth and violence, so how these other kind of factors also contribute to crime. And then a bunch of different scholars talking about governance and how governance has been changing in our cities. And obviously there's a lot of literature in the Latin American context, with sort of the rise of drug gangs and talking about sort of the parallel state, etc. And I'm not going to get into much of those debates. It's still a bit unclear to us to what extent these debates are useful for us, because a lot of these debates are happening in places like Latin America and South Africa. And then again, a bunch of different theories where people have been talking about, which are interlinked with these factors, but there are a bunch of different theories that talk about why violence occurs in cities, why crime occurs. So for instance, the social disorganization theory says that because rapid urbanization leads to sort of fragmented communities, this often creates various kind of situations which can lead to crime. Others saying that this doesn't explain why some communities that become vulnerable in this process actually engage in crime, whereas others don't, or why some people do and others don't. And so there are psychological and behavioral theories that talk about more about sort of the way in which people are specifically socialized in different settings, and which might make them more violent prone, etc. And then there's a long sort of history on theories that focus on the built environment, about how the way in which we actually plan and design our built environments can lead to crime or fear of violence, etc. So we are kind of in conversation with some of this, but we are at a stage in our research where the fieldwork is done, and we're trying to figure out, sort of how to engage with this literature again. In terms of types of violence also, there's a huge literature out there. People like Carolyn Moser, whose work is very often, frequently cited in the urban violence literature, she sort of categorizes types of urban violence as economic violence, political violence, social violence, and institutional violence, and where she's basically talking about motivation. So if the motivation is economic gain, then she categorizes it as economic violence. Coming from the perspective of urban planning and governance, it's very difficult sometimes to put these different, motivations as separate. Often these are intertwined motivations, economic power and political power, for instance. So I'm just kind of sharing this, but it's, I think the research that has formed a bit of basis for us is sort of thinking about infrastructural violence. So Bruce O'Neill and Dennis Rogers, in an article of theirs, they talk about infrastructural violence, and they differentiate between active infrastructural violence and passive infrastructural violence. I'm not, again, very sure how useful that difference is. Basically, they define active infrastructural violence as, for instance, an example of slum demolitions would be a kind of active infrastructural violence, whereas passive infrastructural violence would be, say, the denial of water supply. But oftentimes denial, I think we know that denials of infrastructure can also often be quite active decisions. And so these differences within infrastructural violence, I'm not sure how useful they are, but I think we're in conversation with some of this literature, and some of this will become clearer as our research, writing gets ahead. For us, in a sense, then we are coming to the concept of violence from a much more broader perspective. Thinking about this as structural violence, certainly deprivation, marginalization due to urban policies and planning that exclude urban poor and lower income groups. But we're also interested in then exploring the links of this to direct violence or physical violence. So these could be of different types: self-inflicted, domestic, and interpersonal. I mean, we haven't really been looking at domestic violence in this project because I do think it's sort of a different domain. But nonetheless, group violence, or between two different groups of people, you might have them conflicting and tipping into violence, institutional violence. And then we are looking at crime as well, but it's not sort of the only thing that we're looking at. And one of the things is, of course, that some crimes are violent, for instance, murders, etc., but others, like theft, would not be considered violent in the general understanding of the term. And then some types of direct violence, for instance, state violence, is not considered crime at all. So we come to this research sort of, when I'm saying urban violence, I'm encompassing all these different kinds of violence and crime. And coming to this also from the perspective of conflict, which Moser and Horn define as situations where individuals and groups have incongruent interests that are contradictory and potentially mutually exclusive. So I think this sort of cities are clearly spaces of conflict with incongruent competing interests. And these conflicts could be both covert as well as overt. But I think one of the things that we're also interested in is to trace these conflicts, but also to see that when they're not resolved, how do they sort of tip over into some kind of direct violence, whether it's interpersonal or between two groups or with the state. And so, as I said, one of the things we're interested in is then this transformation of one type of violence into another. Now, more sort of broadly, I think, I mean, of course, we're coming to this research from a very sort of rich literature, rich scholarship that is out there in terms of understanding planning and spaces of the urban poor, informal spaces. Of course, the concept of informality goes beyond spaces of, of poverty. But I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. But I just want to say that, in a sense, we're coming to looking at urban planning and governance from this perspective of, much larger literature and debate that has been going around in terms of how we understand planning, the link between planning and non-planning. So, questions about how master planning is always also sort of non-planning or spaces of informality have been an integral part of master planning. They've been the underside of it. Created by the kind of exclusionary master planning approach that has been taken, or in the last decade or two with increasing intercity competition and this move towards, creating global cities or world-class cities, dispossession, sort of this new urban development hinging on dispossessing the poor, criminalizing their habitats and livelihoods, and so violence being integral to these processes. A lot of people have also written about, increasingly kind of writing about how the state and state practices themselves are often quite informal. So it is not that planning has always been exclusionary. There have been instances where there have been mechanisms of redistributive planning, but what we've often found is that these these kind of provisions that are made by the state are often subverted by state actors themselves in favor of elites. And so the state, in a sense, selectively implements some of its own plans and legislations in favor of certain groups, which are the elites. And then also, I think increasing a number of people have been pointing to the fact that it's not just the poor who engage in sort of, creating informal settlements. You have also the elites who often are creating, gated communities which have various kinds of, semi-formalities to it. But the state basically taking a selective approach in terms of which informalities it legitimizes or might give possibility for legalizing, and other ones which are sort of constantly delegitimized and marginalized. And along with sort of the state being a very key actor in these processes of planning and governance, we've seen kind of a rise of a whole range of non-state actors operating within sort of the planning domain, operating with specific interests and with diverse kind of relations with the state or with state actors of, political actors who are either part of the state or sort of on the fringe of the state, who are involved in the production of space in different ways. So we are kind of in conversation with a lot of this literature as we try to unpack some of the planning and governance dynamics in our specific areas that we're looking at, and how they then unfold to create various kinds of everyday violence in the lives of people living in these neighborhoods. Again, along with the literature on exclusionary planning and the dynamics around that, there's also been a lot of scholarship on sort of planning and urban citizenship, talking about how formal citizenship has obviously not been realized in our cities, and substantive citizenship is something that needs to be negotiated through resistance or political negotiation, contestation, etc. And different sort of people talking about this from different perspectives. So people like Solomon Benjamin talking about local democracy, in a sense, how creating local political alliances at the ground level does ensure some sort of local democracy, and he talks about this as kind of occupancy urbanism. Others who are talking about how NGOs and CBOs are being seen as kind of sort of the channels through which the citizenship can be negotiated, but also questioning whether one can escape the kind of patronage relationships and the differentiated power that exists in local communities and sort of poor localities, and therefore whether the kind of negotiations that happen through NGOs or CBOs can actually realize citizenship in any sort of universal way then. Again, Ananya Roy's also research, and Sapna's Doshi's research on the politics of evicted, again talking, I think, unpacking some of these differentiated subjectivities through which negotiations and contestations happen, sort of alerting us to the possibility that there are paradoxes within these negotiations and contestations, that you might have differentiated interests even within the urban poor, who then position themselves in different ways in this terrain of sort of negotiating urban citizenship. So we're also interested, in a sense, in these kind of processes of negotiation, understanding the kind of questions that this literature has raised, and what does this mean then for conflict and violence that occurs at the local level. So coming to Ahmedabad, from that, I forgot to ask actually, how much time do I have? Can someone flag me when I'm 10 minutes away?
Sure, about standard thing of 45 minutes.
Okay, so if you can just flag me. So I don't know how, I guess I'm assuming that people know more about Ahmedabad today than they did 10 years ago. Nonetheless, just to take you very briefly through kind of a broader context of Ahmedabad's development over the last decade especially, the city has been kind of really developing at a much rapid pace than earlier, and what we've seen is much greater investment in large-scale urban beautification and infrastructure projects, which have taken place in the last decade, often at the cost of the urban poor. And these are projects that have been funded both through the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, but also a lot of what I'm generally sort of calling homegrown projects, so the Sabarmati Riverfront project or some of the lake redevelopment projects, which have been financed at the local level or by the state government to some extent, or pushed by the state government, but not linked to the JNNURM, which has had an impact obviously on many cities in India. So our estimates are that about 25,000 families have been displaced from slums under these different projects, and most of this resettlement has been extremely ad hoc. It has involved most of these communities going to the courts through PILs, and a lot of them have been resettled through the BSUP housing, the basic services to the urban poor, houses that were built on the city's periphery, mainly on the eastern side of the river, which is a less developed area of the city. Over the last 4 or 5 years, the government of Gujarat has also been pushing for moving towards the Mumbai's SRS model, so involving private developers to redevelop the slums in Ahmedabad through the PPP model. It's not really picked up much because of various reasons, but I'm not going to get into that. The street vendor, there's been struggles around street vending for many years. The Self-Employed Women's Association, SEVA, has been working with street vendors for a very long time, and they've been trying to lobby with the local government. But after a PIL in the courts also, what ultimately materialized was a very regressive street vendor scheme. So there are continuing evictions and harassment of street vendors, and the city has been sort of expanding on the peripheries in various ways, and what we find is there is an absence of the sort of the state in terms of giving basic services in this area, and that's something I'll talk about more in the rest of this presentation. Also, again, I think I'll kind of not say much about the town planning schemes. A lot of this presentation is about that. But one of the things that we are, I think, seeing in Ahmedabad is that current planning processes in various ways seem to be deepening, in a sense, reproducing and deepening certain kind of spatial segmentation in the city around class, caste, and religion. And religious segmentation, also I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. So that's just kind of a larger background within which this particular case study of Bombay Hotel has been taken up. So Bombay Hotel basically is what we would call an informal commercial subdivision, which is agricultural land on the urban periphery that has been informally subdivided and converted for residential, commercial, etc. use. So without the necessary planning, development permissions, agricultural land being developed for other uses. And one of the things is that, of course, we want to locate this emergence of informal commercial subdivisions in Ahmedabad in the broader context of exclusionary planning. And this is, some of these processes are not limited to Ahmedabad, they're limited, I mean, they span other sort of Indian cities as well. So, for instance, a lot of these informal commercial subdivisions, not all of them, but a lot of them are populated by lower income, lower middle class families, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that, you know, the markets can't really provide affordable housing to them, and the state has, in a sense, failed to create mechanisms to provide affordable housing to them. So just things like the, you know, Urban Land Ceiling Act, the failure to kind of implement it and allocate, redistribute land basically, or in Ahmedabad specifically with the town planning schemes, there is a mechanism for reserving land, for allocating land for the socially and economically weaker section. But a lot of, so in all of the town planning schemes, which I'll talk more about, you're supposed to allocate up to 10% of the land for this housing, but what one finds is that not more than 3 to 4% of this land is actually allocated, and within that, not more than 5 to 6% is actually then used for the for building this housing. And so even this, as I said, even these kind of redistributive or welfare mechanisms that exist in planning are not really used, they're subverted or just underused because of various reasons. And what we also find, as I said, I'll explain the TP scheme, the town planning schemes in a moment, but one of the things also is that on the urban peripheries of Ahmedabad, before the town planning schemes come in to urbanize the land in some sort of a orderly manner, what we often find is that sale and development of this agricultural land has already begun, often in anticipation of the fact that a town planning scheme is going to come in. And so, and often there are these delays in implementation which further sort of add to the issues of exclusionary planning. So these are sort of, in the case of Ahmedabad, trying to, link these emergence of informal commercial subdivisions to broader processes of planning in the city. And along with that, parallel to that, in Ahmedabad, what we also find is that a lot of these informal subdivisions on the southern periphery of the city are also areas which are Muslim enclaves. So I'll talk a bit more about this in a bit, but basically, I think most of you perhaps know that Ahmedabad is almost completely segregated by religion. This was not the case even perhaps 15 years ago, but there's a longer history which I'll talk about. But today Ahmedabad is sort of pretty much completely segregated. There's discrimination against Muslims in the Hindu areas of the city. And formal housing, we find, has become increasingly out of the reach of Muslims, whether these are poor Muslims, who share that predicament with poor Hindus as well in the city, but even the middle classes among Muslims, formal housing has become more and more difficult to access. And so a combination of these processes of exclusionary planning and communal politics in the city has led to basically a southern periphery comprising of a whole bunch of sort of contiguous areas which are sort of Muslim localities. And Johapura is perhaps one that a lot of people would have heard about, but it's by no means the only one. It's repeatedly talked about, but there are other areas next to it. It continues to be a growing area. So areas of Gyaspur, Maktampura, Sarkhej, Makarba, Shahwadi, these are all sort of contiguous to Johapura. Dani Limra is on the other side of the river and closer to Bombay Hotel, but these are all in the southern periphery. So just to give you a sort of introduction and sort of understanding of the town planning schemes, because a lot of the research is trying to engage with this particular planning mechanism and how this planning mechanism is unfolded or was absent in a sense for a long time in this area, creating various kinds of conflicts and violence. So the town planning schemes, of course, actually they have a much longer history. They go back to the colonial period, but I'm not going to go over that history just now. The current town planning schemes, the way they are made in Ahmedabad, are governed by the Gujarat Town Planning and Urban Development Act of 1976. And this has become a very well-regarded planning mechanism. So in the last decade or so, town planning schemes, more than I think 200 town planning schemes have been made and prepared in Ahmedabad in the last 15 years or so. Not all of them have been implemented yet, but they've been prepared. And they've been touted as a planning mechanism that is much more equitable and democratic as compared to, say, land acquisition through eminent domain. And so this is something that is also being talked about, a kind of planning mechanism that can be scaled up or taken to other parts of the country, etc. So in terms of understanding this mechanism, this is basically based on these twin concepts of land pooling and readjustment. Now what this means is that, so in Ahmedabad, like other cities, we have a development plan, and the area of the newly urban sort of areas that are added to the development plan are further sort of marked into smaller pockets of 1 to 2 square kilometers, and a town planning scheme is made for each of them. These are new agricultural lands that are sort of entering the city limits, rather the urban limits, and all the agricultural land in that area is pooled. So these are private landowners, farmers whose land is pooled, and the local authority reconstitutes these plots of land. A certain amount of land from each of the land parcels is taken up to 40%, and that is used to build roads, other infrastructure, allocate land for hospitals, schools, etc. Also for housing for the socially and economically weaker section. And also some land is kept aside for residential and commercial sale, which the local authority would auction in order to raise revenue and cover the costs of this infrastructure. So some compensation is given for this land that is acquired, which is up to 40%, and then the land auction also, as I said, raises revenue. So, and the reconstituted land parcels. So as a private landowner, I might get I will get a land parcel back which is up to 40% less than the area I owned, and it could be in the same nearby or it could be a bit further away. And because of the infrastructure that is put in, the idea is that your land value will shoot up, and there's a land valuation that is done on the basis of which half of the increase of the land value is to be paid by the landowner as betterment charge, and that betterment charge is also meant to raise revenue and cover the infrastructure costs. So because of this land value increase, landowners are considered to have a much greater stake in the process and not actually lose their land with just very poor compensation. They are actually able to benefit out of this higher land value that accrues to them. And during this process, there are various stages in this town planning scheme. So after a survey is done, there's a draft town planning scheme that's prepared, and then preliminary town planning scheme, and then finally a final town planning scheme. And at each of these stages, the landowners are also given some space for raising objections. These are objections pertaining mainly to the plot and not to the planning scheme as a whole. So the whole idea of participation is quite limited, but nonetheless, compared to perhaps other planning mechanisms, it has this space. And usually implementation of the town planning scheme begins after the draft stage is approved by the state government. So one of the critiques of this has been that the town planning scheme has to be sanctioned by the state government as opposed to the local authority, and so there is the power to do that does not lie at the local level. There are various other critiques that have been sort of made about the town planning schemes, which I'm not going to get into actually just now, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that, farmers, for instance, lose their land before the town planning scheme even comes in because speculators already buy them out. So it's often not the farmer who benefits, but the speculator who benefits. And so there are real questions, but a lot of these critiques don't necessarily apply to the Bombay Hotel case, except for well, I'll talk about that more. But there are critiques already about the town planning schemes, and I think our case study presents another sort of set of critiques and provokes questions around it. Okay, so in terms of, before I go into Bombay Hotel in detail, I just wanted to flag up the fact that Bombay Hotel is an area that came up mainly after 2002. But by no means is religious segmentation in Ahmedabad a condition of post-2002. There's a long history of Ahmedabad having communal riots, and it's really the mid-1980s that set off this sort of increasing polarization in space, which has become more and more consolidated over time. And so with the mid-1980s, you saw that polarization happening mainly in the eastern areas of the city, where Muslims and Dalits as working class of the textile mills used to live together, and they started moving away from each other. After the post-Babri Masjid demolition, you saw an area like Juhapura, which was initially a resettlement site for some riverfront resettlees back in the 1980s. So the Hindus moving out of Juhapura, and so the polarization in space has occurred in different areas of the city over different times, and 2002 has just consolidated that and limited the space where Muslims can expand. And I'm not going to get into the explanations of this just now. But I think one of the things is, of course, to realize is that religious segregation is not completely new in Ahmedabad. I mean, there is a long history of that, but the geographies and the meanings of that segregation have changed over this period of communal politics and violence. So Bombay Hotel is located sort of there on the map. if you think about Ahmedabad, the easiest way of explaining Ahmedabad is that the western side is kind of a more well-planned upper middle class affluent area, which isn't entirely true because the southern part of western Ahmedabad is where Juhapura lies. But that's, and the eastern side of the river has the walled city. Beyond that, further east are the textile mill areas, so the working class areas, which are also transforming, however, over time. And as I said, it's this southern belt which has become the Muslim enclaves, and Bombay Hotel is that one of the spaces there.
Renu, is Bombay Hotel inside or outside the ring road?
It's inside the ring road. Yeah. So there's still some farmland around there. Even the ring road is actually quite a bit away. It's almost at the edge of the municipal limits.
This grey edge is the municipal limit?
Yeah, so the grey is the municipal limits. So in that sense, it might not seem to be the periphery, except that a lot of that southern part is still agricultural land, mixed with some villages, and there are some middle, lower income neighborhoods also coming up. But a lot of that is agriculture, so in that sense, it's the urban periphery still. So Bombay Hotel, basically, the residential part of it is about 1 square kilometer. It's surrounded by some industrial users, and around 20 to 25,000 households, we estimate, live in this locality. I'll take you through the politics of the area later on. This is just a table that should not have been perhaps inserted. Yeah, well, before I think go further ahead, just to kind of give you a sense of what our research has involved in terms of doing fieldwork in this area, we'd done some preliminary visits in the area in 2013, but the main fieldwork in this area was done over 2014. I was actually not very much involved at that time. There was a research associate at our center who did a lot of the focus group discussions, the interviews, and we were collaborating with an NGO that works in the area called the Center for Development. So one of the staff of the area also was part of the research team. So these two people basically did much of the research over 2014. And then over 2015, I have been involved in a lot of follow-ups, analysis, writing, further follow-ups, etc. And so what we've done in this locality is sort of ethnography that has been more so in 2015. We've done about 16 focus group discussions in the area, covering men and women, and we developed a set of FGD tools which were meant to trace the linkages of what they thought was creating conflict in their lives. So we created these kind of tools of causal flow diagrams. So I don't have a diagram of that. I could have perhaps showed it to you. But and then about 21 semi-structured interviews with key informants, local leaders, water operators in the locality, and some interviews with government officials and local politicians, NGO activists, some builders in the city. And one of the master's students at CEPT also did her thesis in the area, which was under the project, and she was focusing on gender and transport safety. So there were a bunch of FDGs that were also done as part of her research. So yeah, as I was saying, that Bombay Hotel has emerged mainly since 2002, but this is, I mean, it's mainly emerged since 2002, but it's a process that had begun already in the mid to late 1990s. Basically, farmers had already begun to sell their land informally, and one large woman woman farmer landowner in the area had kind of informally bought off land from a lot of the smaller farmers. In some cases, we've heard that it was done coercively. In other cases, it seems that she did them a favor. So it's not very clear, but there has been one large landowner in the area who played a main role in this, and then a whole bunch of Muslim builders. So she seems to have been kind of a middle woman in this process. And there are indications that she had links to a Congress politician. And in 2002, when the riots happened, basically so there was already some activity in the area of Muslim builders, but because this is an area that's flanked by Juhapura across the river, and Shah Alam, which is also a Muslim area on the other side. So it was just a natural progression of Muslim growth in a sense to come and start looking at this area as a potential area to reside in. But after 2002, one of the things that happened is that a couple of charity organizations who built post-riot kind of rehabilitation housing, they identified some land in this area and they built housing over here for some of the riot victims. All of this has been done informally, so the riot victims don't have any legal papers, so that's part of the informal, in a sense, process. And then a Congress politician who, city level, quite powerful Congress politician, has played a key role in connecting Muslim builders to the this large farmer landowner who's a Hindu woman. And so there are these various links, in a sense, through which this area has got developed. And then a large Muslim builder in the city, who I'm going to call Sikandar Builders, who has played a major role, and it's a bit unclear. It's clear that he has links to the Congress, but it seems that of late he's also started developing links to the BJP. And Sikandar Builders has created various kinds of invisible partnerships with smaller builders. So his name would not be in the front, but he has financed smaller builders and who have been active in this area. And so when you ask people, who's the builder of your society, they refer to some small-time builder, but often these are builders who are linked with this guy, with Sikandar Builders. And so this whole set of actors have developed these plotted societies, or they've constructed tenements on these plots and sold them. And so that's kind of the supply side of the process. And in terms of demand, as I said, because more and more Muslims were looking for safe and affordable areas among the lower income population, a lot of them began to look at this area. And one of the things is also Juhapura started to become saturated in terms of, there were rising land prices even in Juhapura given the constrained market. So poor and lower income Muslims looking at other areas in the city, which would be safe areas and affordable. And builders were offering very attractive payment options. So there are instances where builders were selling at 10 rupees a day. So you could buy a plot by paying the builder 10 rupees a day, but up to say 1,000 rupees a month. So various kinds of installment schemes, etc. And also affordable rents in the area. So there's a large tenant population also, that a part of which has also started converting to owners over time as their socioeconomic situation gets better. And so there's this mix of the natural growth of the Muslim population in the city, living in, say, walled city areas which are congested, and so moving out, wanting to have a house of their own, along with intra-state and interstate migrants who cannot find another space in the polarized geography of the city, and because there are industrial workshops, etc. nearby. So basically these are the kind of conflicts and violence that we have been we have traced and focused on. One that has to do with tenure security and land conflicts, which is the main one I will be talking about. I'll talk only a little bit about conflicts over access to basic services, depends on the time. And again, same, depending on the time, I may or may not touch upon the crime and violence against women. And basically with each of these types of conflicts, violence, crime, we've been trying to trace the development processes, the agents, the impacts on people, how people have been responding to these dynamics, and what kind of interventions have arisen in this context. So this is what you can see. The map on the right side is kind of one of the builder's maps of the subplotting that he has done in the locality. So there are these small plots of 40, I'm forgetting now, sorry, but pretty small plots. And what you see here is Azad Nagar row houses. So this was a society where the tenements were also built and they were sold at 1,000 rupees a month installments. And all of these transactions basically from the farmer onwards have been informal. So if you look at property documents, they continue to have the original farmers' names on them. And the current residents, they have what are known as stamp papers. So these are unregistered sales deeds that they have, and all the construction has occurred without converting the land from agricultural to non-agricultural use. No other kind of building permissions have been taken. So no NOCs refers to the no objection certificates that you're supposed to get when you construct anything in the city. but no one has taken these development permissions. And this has led to a series of sort of a sense of insecurity that is sort of shifted over time. In a place like Citizen Nagar B, which is one of the societies, so the entire area comprises of about probably 250 to 300 different societies. And Citizen Nagar B is a society that was built as a rehabilitation colony for the riot victims. And the builder, this Sikandar Builders, was involved in that. So the charity gave money to these builders and they built the society. So one of the things is that in this society, people don't even have the stamp paper. So there's a lack of documents, and the builder has his men who continues to keep a surveillance in the society. So people are not even able to make any change to their house. And there is a real sense of, being evicted from this place in the future because of this situation. In a lot of cases, we've heard of double booking of plots by the builders. So often the builder would have sold off the plot to more than one person, and then each of the buyers would have to try and find their own, sources of power to claim that plot. And then some instances, we've not come across a lot, but some instances of land grabbing. So if a person has bought a plot informally, but it's not yet been constructed, it's lying vacant, then a gang would kind of occupy it and tell the owner that, we'll give it back to you only if you pay us money. So extortion through that. So those are the kind of processes that were occurring for a long time and continue to some extent to occur in the area. But then what we saw is that from 2013, the town planning scheme, the implementation of the town planning scheme began. And the kind of insecurity that emerged with that had to do much more around the threat of demolition. And I'll talk about the responses later on. So if you look at this, so this is the Bombay Hotel area. The two town planning schemes that cover this area are known as the Town Planning Scheme 38-1 and 38-2. And so it's actually the lower half of this, which is the Bombay Hotel area. And what you can see in this is that there are obviously the roads that have been put in, and then all these different kinds of plots which are either reserved by the local authority to auction for residential and commercial or industrial use. Some of them are reserved for hospital, school, neighborhood center, garden, open space, housing for socially and economically weaker section, police station, ward office, but the whole area has already been built up in a sense. And the town planning scheme at this point, coming in 2013, has created the situation of that if you're going to implement it this way, then it's going to lead to a lot of demolitions. And there are some estimates that say 2,500 families will get displaced. I don't know who has done these surveys, but these are figures that are kind of floating around. So to sort of take you back then to the town planning scheme's history in this area. So the town planning, this area came under the municipal limits in 1975, which was quite a long time back. But the preliminary land surveys in the area for the town planning scheme took place around 2003-2004. Now, as I said, during this time, the area was just beginning to kind of develop. There was some subplotting that had already occurred, but there were not a lot of houses on the ground, even though informal transactions had already occurred, and it's very unlikely that a lot of farmers continue to hold land in the area. It was already in the hands of middlemen, etc. So one of the things is also that according to the Town Planning Act, it should take about 4 years from the survey to the final town planning scheme. Whereas in reality, and this has been found across the city, it's one of the critiques of the town planning scheme's implementation is that just to move from draft town planning scheme to preliminary town planning scheme often takes more than a decade. So in that sense, this is not unusual for the area. This has happened in a lot of other areas as well, that the preliminary surveys are done in 1 year and then it takes almost a decade for it to start getting implemented on the ground. And so what you find is that finally implementation has begun towards the end of 2013, and no work seems to have, it's not very clear whether the town planning officer has started work on preparing the preliminary scheme, and so it's in this state of limbo in terms of the next stage. But implementation has begun because you can start putting in roads, etc., according to the act at the stage of the scheme.
So in the town planning scheme, who are they recognizing as the owners?
Yeah, so I think that is exactly what I'm going to coming up to next. So I mean, the main issue is around that in an area like this, which is completely developed and occupied by informal owners, who are completely excluded from this process. So the people who have a voice in this process are the original sort of the documented landowners. Um, it continues. I mean, very little research has been done on the town planning schemes in Ahmedabad. So, I mean, I have questions that I have no answers for as well. For instance, the fact that if you have speculators who've taken land informally from farmers, how do they influence the process of the town planning scheme subsequently? Because their names are not on paper, but yet they do exercise some. But no one has done the research to trace this yet. But in this case, I mean, even the builders and middlemen are nowhere in the process anymore. These are just completely developed and occupied areas. And so the informal owners have no say in this process. They are not informed about the scheme except in terms of the fact that your structure will get demolished. So it would be served an eviction notice like you would in a squatter settlement. And so some of the houses here did get eviction notices. In a lot of other areas, eviction notices were not given. There were verbal sort of instances, but it was only because of local mobilization, some of the leaders in the area who had begun to get active in the last 5 years, and a couple of NGOs who got hold of the town planning scheme maps and tried to pore over them and figure out what this map is showing in terms of allocation of land, and which of these lands are already built up. And this, I think, has been a very interesting process, that the initial local mobilization, basically the local leaders started to, talk to residents in the area, and it seems that, about 200, 300 objection letters were written by various residents who were anticipating that their properties would be demolished. I don't know what came out of those objection letters, but one of the things that did happen is that it led to a lot of concern among the elected councillor in the area for reasons that I will discuss perhaps discuss later on. We are still trying to understand some of these dynamics, but the local councillor basically sent his men to threaten some of the leaders, saying that you guys need to back off from doing these protests. And there was a negotiation. The leaders basically threatened to go off and give support to another Congress party leader. But anyway, at the end of the day, the elected councillor who had sent his men to threaten the local leaders ultimately ended up leading a rally against the demolitions. And so there's been this shift towards political patronage that has begun in 2014. And a negotiation with the municipal commissioner, so various meetings have been organized, etc., to limit the demolition. So what you see here in terms of the very wide, some of these roads that have been put in over here on paper are extremely wide, and people have questioned what is the necessity of these kind of road widths in this area. And so the local government has finally agreed to demolish as little as possible, enough to put in sort of new drainage lines and water supply lines, and not more than that. And so no one has actually lost their full property. People have lost part of their property, but nobody has lost their full property because of these negotiations that have occurred. Now, this has been an interesting process, and I think there are two things that are worth talking about in this context, which has basically links to this question of what is the possibility for inclusion then, when you have a planning mechanism that is exclusionary in certain respects given how it unfolds and it is designed, and then when you have this possibility for local mobilization, political patronage emerging over time. And I think these are open questions, but I think they show us what the possibilities or limitations might be. So one of the things is that if you look at again this map, within the town planning schemes there are certain norms. So for instance, there's a norm that around 15%, maximum 20% of the land would be allocated for roads. What we find is that in one of the TP schemes actually almost 30%, 28% has been allocated for roads. In the other one it's almost 20%. For parks and playgrounds, you can see that the norm is 5%, but much less has been allocated. For social infrastructure, Again, much less in one of the TP schemes has been allocated. And then for sale of land, also relatively less has been allocated than is the norm. But it is still, according to some arguments, are that in an area that is kind of was obviously going to be developed as a poor, lower class Muslim area, why would you allocate so much land for residential and commercial sale? And you can see that for socially and economically weaker section housing, again the amount allocated is much less than the norm, but that's something we find across different town planning schemes in Ahmedabad. Now, one of the things is that, so I think one of the things that I talked about was the delay of the town planning scheme, which is a broader process. It's not just in this particular case of Bombay Hotel, but which creates a condition where you have a completely developed locality, informally developed locality when the actual implementation begins. Of course, the question is that even when the surveys were done in 2003, 2004, clearly a lot of this area was already under change, even though it was not constructed, and so it is not clear whether the AMC knew about the changes that were occurring. I think arguably they would have known. Nonetheless, they went on to sort of plan this area, this TP scheme in the way that they have. But the other question besides the delays is also the question of the design of the TP scheme and what implications that could have for the present and the future. So again, sort of going back to the fact of, informal owners being excluded. So one of the things is that while the municipal commissioner has currently agreed that the road is not going to be widened more than 15 meters or something like that, at some point, what we find in the rest of Ahmedabad, for instance, in areas where the TP schemes have already been implemented 10, 15, 20 years ago, road widenings have become a common feature across the city, and a lot of these TP roads, as they call them, have led to evictions, and it's something, in another project, we are just generally tracing the evictions that have been occurring in Ahmedabad beyond the Sabarmati riverfront evictions, because that is well known, but we don't know much about why other evictions are occurring. And TP roads are one of the main reasons. So even though you might have, a road that is currently being implemented only in terms of a narrower width, the fact that this is on paper, at any point in the future, these roads can be widened, and so the tenure security of these families is going to be in limbo in that sense. The same is for the reservation lands, although the possibility of eviction from the reservation lands, again, at least at the moment, in the next 5-6 years, seems to be quite low, but again, in the future, one doesn't know how this will play out. But even for the immediate sort of present, the question of entitlement to basic services, and this takes me into another direction of sort of basic services, but entitlement to basic services is unclear for those who are living on these TP roads and reservation lands, because the local government will not give them what is known as a NOC. It's a NOC for slum areas. The AMC has this NOC for slum areas. So in slums where a person has a structure that is less than 40 square meters in area, they can apply to the local government for a NOC, which makes them entitled to then get a water and sanitation connection once they pay a fee for that. But on the TP roads here and the reservation lands, these families would not be entitled to get the NOC. So even though they might not be demolished, it's not clear whether they will be connected to the service, and quite possibly they will be, some of them will be, and again political patronage is likely to play out in terms of determining who gets connected, how soon, etc. So I think there is this sort of trade-off between basic services and tenure security that is and is likely to play out in the future. One of the city planners in the local government that we interviewed basically told us that the fact that the area is occupied, they will have to just bear with the fact that they will not have a school and a hospital, etc., because we are not going to go and demolish the houses that are occupying these lands. And so there is also this kind of conflict that is set up between the housing needs of some of the families and kind of the larger common good of the families, and this could create conflict in the future as people in the area start demanding for schools, but things like that which can be given only if you demolish the houses of some of the families. So yeah, how am I doing on time? I can keep going? Okay, so well, as I said, please just flag me out. Okay. So I think I'll discuss the conflicts around the basic services because it also has links to the town planning schemes. Now, in terms of the basic services in the area, until a couple of years ago, the state was basically just kind of absent in a sense from the area. And there's been sort of the continuing absence of the state even for until 2011, 2012, 2013 in different ways, has led to an entrenchment of various kind of informal non-state actors in basic services provision. And this is particularly so around water, which is what I will mainly, I think, talk about. Now, of course, the question is, who are these non-state actors? And I mean, sort of, is it simply kind of absence of the state, or are there connections to the state or to political leaders, etc.? And I mean, a lot of these informal non-state actors in the beginning were simply the builders who were in this area. So they have built bore wells. Most of the water provision in this area is through bore wells, which gives contaminated water supply, because I forgot to mention that Ahmedabad's garbage dump is on the western edge of this locality, and there's also industrial use. So because of both of these things, the water in the locality is quite contaminated. But there's a sort of huge number of bore wells in the area, anticipated to be anywhere sort of about 200 for sure. And I mean, these are builders. Some of these builders ultimately got out of the bore well provisioning, but other kind of actors have emerged in this space. In some cases, these are residents from the locality who have the money to put forward to dig a bore well and start then selling water to others. In some of the areas, though, it has been sort of, I mean, there are arguments that in some of the areas, not just anybody can dig a bore well and start selling water. So there is some control over who can start doing this. So the Center for Development, which is the NGO that we are collaborating with, some years ago, they were trying to get funds from elsewhere to dig a bore well and see if a kind of community bore well can be made. But the water operator in that locality basically just, there was some threat from him, and it would have led to a lot of conflict with him, and so they did not go ahead and pursue this. So there is this kind of basically muscle power or links to, I mean, I'm still frankly unclear about who they have links to, despite having tried to find out, but certainly there is muscle power that is involved, and links to some of the builders in some localities. In some localities, people have actually collectively also put in money and dug their own bore wells. So it's not a even space in terms of the kind of control and coercion that occurs. But there are some areas in which some of these bore well operators hold enough power to kind of dissuade others from creating bore wells in the area. And sort of the logics and modalities through which this provision happens. Oh, sorry, there's been some keyboard problem there. But the logics and modalities of provision, I mean, territoriality in the provision is very clear. So in terms of a resident who might be getting water from one borewell operator, if that borewell breaks down or if the water becomes more contaminated than even otherwise acceptable, cannot easily go and get a connection from another borewell, because borewells the operators respect each other's territories, and it could lead to conflicts between them if they start supplying to the other person's clients. So there's a strong territoriality in service provision, which leads to various kinds of deprivations, and possibility of conflict dissuades people from exploring these other possibilities. Profit motives, obviously, that is the main thing kind of running this delivery in the area, and because there is sort of I mean, the only regulation that is there, informal regulation, through each other's kind of, through borewell operators, informally sort of regulating the territories that each one is providing in, but it's a very sort of poorly regulated area in that sense. And so sometimes the borewell operator might not be able to give water for a week, but he will continue to collect the monthly payment. Or people might not have got water thrice in a month for periods of 6-7 days, and yet people will have to pay the monthly charge. And so in that sense, the profit motive and the lack of any kind of oversight and regulation continues to create these exploitative relationships. And then a lot of these informal providers, not all of them, but a lot of them also employ all kinds of coercive tactics. So an instance would be in one neighborhood, some of the family, I mean, this has happened in a bunch of different neighborhoods, but if a family is not able to provide, pay the monthly charge on time, then the borewell supplier would just cut supply to the entire society, which would lead to a conflict between the residents and pressure, so kind of peer pressure on this family to pay this money. In other cases, often women have talked about these borewell operators being drunk and intoxicated very often, especially when they come to collect their money, and so various kinds of coercive and threatening behavior and practices that have come up. In some cases, I do want to say that there are exceptions, and that there are instances where borewell operators have tried to, if their borewell is not working, tried to create an arrangement with a neighboring borewell operator to provide supply for a few days, etc. But largely speaking, these are the kind of modalities. And with the state sort of coming in, and I'm not talking about the town planning scheme yet, but the state has began to come in around 2012, 11 onwards, basically as this area got reconfigured in terms of the political constituencies in which it was. So when the municipal wards got sort of redrawn, etc., this area ended up in a constituency where a Congress leader came into power for the first time in 2010. So previous to this, one of the local leaders told us that when he had approached the mayor of the city, who was from the BJP at the time, he basically just said that development in your area is not on our agenda. And it wasn't clear exactly what that meant. It could have had clearly a sense of, so this is not just about the town planning scheme, but even in terms of political patronage, the BJP not being amenable to, providing patronage in Muslim areas, but which began to change as this Congress councillor got voted into power here in 2010, and then in the state assembly elections, a Congress MLA came into power. Before him, this used to be under Amit Shah's constituency of Sarkhej, and so the local political patronage therefore changed quite a lot from this point onwards. And gradually water tankers started coming into this area. Some drainage in some societies began to be given, some street lighting in some places. But one of the things that we are partly arguing is that the geography of this political patronage and services provision has to do with the geography of the active local leaders and who are connected to this councillor and the MLA. And so it's not an even process across the entire locality. So actually, sorry, I've already talked about this, but this is just, but in this case, there was a local leader who had complained to the elected representative about the poor quality of water being supplied by the borewell operator, and the operator got angry at the complaint and he cut off supply. And so the residents started arguing with the leader, and there was a conflict for a while between them. A lot of some people referred to these conflicts with water operators over payment using this term of shabdik atyachar, so sort of a verbal torture that they felt when these operators came to collect money from them. And as we see that these kind of conflicts with the operator often translate into conflicts between the residents because of being deprived of these services. There are also, conflicts over things like overflowing drains. There are petty conflicts very often, but one of the things also we heard about one instance where a conflict over an overflowing drain became violent because one of the parties employed some hired goons in the area. So, I mean, there are goons who are on hire in a sense. So, as this person explained, there was a quarrel between two households over an overflowing sewer. First, it was between the women of the households. Later, it extended between the male members also. One of them got many goons who came with weapons. So, we helped the other resident and protected him in our house. The residents from my society started saying that I should not protect him and should throw him out, otherwise these goons will pick a fight with my family also. These goons came in our lane and threatened that whoever has helped this man, we will beat them also. So one of the things is this kind of hired goons, and which has to do with sort of the crime in the area, which I won't talk about just now unless people have questions, can lead to these petty conflicts, turning into something violent. And similarly, I mean, this is a common story across our cities in terms of fights at the water tankers, but I just wanted to flag it up that, in a sense, not just that it happens here, but it has to do with the kind of provision of water tankers in the area. So while this municipal water tankers have started coming in, basically every day 7 4,000 liter tankers make 5 rounds in the area. They stop at sort of 9 different standing points. But if you calculate the water quantity that is provided through this, and this is, from a municipal official himself, he said, we think of it as 140 liters per household, in which case what the tankers are providing is 4% of what the population needs. And so obviously these kind of conflicts are bound to happen. And often there are instances when some woman will come to regulate the queue, etc. And so conflict, in a sense, things might not get physically violent, which in this particular case had happened, and a police had to be called to intervene when 2 women started physically fighting with each other. But even where sometimes these local women come to mediate these processes, what you often find is that they end up siphoning off more water from these tankers than the others, etc. So there is still an inequity that persists. With the TP scheme coming in since 2014, in a sense, it has been bringing in roads, drainage, street lights, not yet water. Water is supposed to start coming in at some point, but drainage, they've started laying drainage in the locality. But as I already explained, a lot of this is going to depend also on the extent to which this infrastructure is laid in relation to the kind of demolitions that would be required for that infrastructure provision. So I think I'm going to kind of stop there. And I had a slide at the end, I'm very sorry, that said preliminary conclusions. But I think I'd just like to kind of stop there, and maybe we're still trying to kind of wrap our head around this research, and linking it to planning as violence, linking it also to the possibilities of negotiating these kind of planning processes, and how that can or cannot mediate conflict and violence. So I don't really have very well thought out things to say yet in terms of conclusions, but maybe if you have questions, and I can. So thank you.